There. Silly thing didn't work right at first. All right. There we go. All right. Actually got the cover on there. Good morning and welcome to Saga Saturday. I am Ula Bredensdottir, your self-professed Norse nerd, joined by actual Norse nerd Bercy.
I've also been self-professed, I guess.
Fair enough. Unfortunately, our lovely Kinnaheld cannot join us today because things in life, but we are going to wrap up Egils Saga, which is
finally
ridiculous, right? It's what was it, 5 episodes just to get through the saga itself, and then this last one for the wrap-up? Like, seriously.
It's only twice as many as we thought it was going to be.
You're right? So, okay.
Just like our episodes.
Yeah, right.
Twice as long as we thought.
I know, right? Probably not the best, but whatever. All right, so a little bit of background. Hopefully y'all have been caught up. If not, well, you're just going to be confused, but...
go watch our other episodes.
Yeah, exactly. Go back. We'll wait. So the song itself was written around 1230, kind of presumed to be done by the poet and writer Snorri Sturluson, but there's debate on that.
At the very least, with anything that's got Snorri Sturluson's name on it, just assume. You can say written by as shorthand, it's fine, but just remember that man was leading a life and probably did not have time or energy. Right. And also there's very different sort of narrative styles going on in a bunch of the different things that he's written. Yeah. So he was a wealthy guy. He was probably hiring people to write for him and then just slapping his name on it, which was totally done and totally normal and totally fine.
Absolutely.
So you can say Snorri Sturluson wrote it and no one will give you any shit for it, but also realize that it is unlikely that he actually sat down physically and wrote down every single part of this. Yeah.
Right. Well, also because there are multiple copies of it. And when I say there's 3 different copies, you froze again. Anyway, so there are multiple copies of this. You know, it's in multiple manuscripts. So whatever. He wrote it, he didn't. But we do know that it was written around 1230 about events that took place between 850 and 1000-ish. It's one of the longest sagas at 90 chapters, or 88, depending on who does the translation. It's part of the Icelandic family saga genre, documents the generational feud between Kveldolf, Egil's grandfather and his descendants, and then King Harald Fairhair of Norway and his descendants. So Egil's grandfather picked a fight with the King of Norway, and they kept that thing going for generations on both sides. So, you know, it's the Hatfields and McCoys here.
Indeed.
And Egil doesn't...
Except one of them is a group of royals and the other one's just some farmers in Iceland.
Whatever. Egil doesn't appear until chapter 31, so about a third of the way in. The previous parts of the manuscript are about his ancestors, and then the last 9 chapters are dedicated to his descendants. So you can trace, one of the great things I love about the Icelandic family sagas is you can trace the begots, the so-and-so is the father of, is the blah, 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 married to, blah, blah. There's some amazing family genealogy that they actually wrote down.
Yeah.
How true it is? I don't know.
It was one of the, as I learned in my class, family and kinship in Viking and medieval textual sources. The genealogies are one of, we usually sort of skip them or read them real fast, or sometimes if you read through them and you're familiar with other sagas, you're like, oh, I recognize those names. Oh, wait, oh my gosh, that's from Lexstyle Saga. I know that guy.
Yes.
And you sort of fit things together, but it's just kind of like interesting intertextuality, not really like all that important in our minds. But it is theorized that those genealogical sections are some of the like sort of one of the main purposes of these books is as a record of those genealogies. and to sort of show like, and there's the reason why it's important that I'm related to Egil, or
Yes.
that like my mother's cousin
Right.
was married to Egil's daughter's
nephew or whatever. Yeah.
Sister or something, because look at how important Egil was, right?
Yes.
Like I'm connected familially to this very important figure.
Yep.
And then also we have this recording of exactly why that's an important figure. And so like the genealogical sections are very boring now to us. But
they're very meaningful in the context of Norse culture. Your relations are, you know, now we're like, my relations, whatever. I never talked to him, right? But in Norse culture, family and relations was huge. It's absolutely important.
The family unit on a farm, and also the people of the household, which usually a household unit, which usually is just like one family and like the either just other people living there, and also slaves and people who are living on a household, is the main political unit in very early medieval Scandinavian everything, until you get a little bit further along and they start emulating, and powerful people like Harold Fairhair start eating up land, consolidating power, centralizing power and wealth, and trying to emulate continental Europe, and trying to be like, oh, we can be more like the Franks. Oh, we can be more like England. We got to have kings. We got to have, because they called them kings, but they were really more like petty kings.
Chieftains. I think of them more as chieftains of, you know, you may be king, but you're king of your own castle, right? Like you're king of your property. You're not a king, you know.
And we were talking about Iceland, which had no formal monarchy until they went underneath. They agreed to go under the Norwegian crown.
Yeah.
They were specifically, literally just a settler culture, with no formalized. They just had a law code. They had one elected official who was the law speaker, and that was a 3-year term. You just recited, and your entire job was basically you often served as a mediator in different legal disputes, but your main job was just to recite 1/3 of the law code every year at the all thing until you got done with it, and then
it was the next guy's turn to do it.
Right. It was like, cool, I memorized the law code, said my bit, I'm done.
Right.
And so like, I don't know why we got on this, but
that's all right. We got anyway, the story itself, the manuscript itself. So there are 60 poems in total. Some are full, some are partial. You know, there's some missing pieces, whatever. But the topics cover everything from threatening another person, praising another person, love, grief, insults. Like there's some really rich poetry. It also includes the Battle of Bruneberg, which is as told from the English side, and the same battle is documented in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles from the Anglo-Saxon side. There's a couple other manuscripts that cover the Battle of Bruneberg. I mean, it was a big deal, but these two are the ones that are really kind of the most cohesive and
detailed, weirdly detailed.
Strangely detailed, especially for having been written, 300 years after it was the battle, but whatever.
And the battles just in general in this saga, if you want to read a saga to watch Vikings fight, so many of them are honestly really kind of boring, because they're like, they fought and so got his leg chopped off and the other guy died, right? It's just like, bullet points. Here's what happened.
But this is so richly detailed, and there's like blood spurting, and there's
and like battle tactics not even just like the full scale battle tactics are super interesting, and like this ploy about like the trick they played on the with delaying the battle until the rest of the army could come there. The optical illusion of pitching the tents on a very narrow strip of land to make it seem like there was a lot more tents, and also not filling them all, only filling every other one.
Having empty tents and just to make it look like their side was better, bigger, while they kind of parlayed back and forth to get more troops in so that they could actually win.
And so they have these really cool, full-scale battle tactics and, tricks and techniques. And then they also have, really interesting, one-on-one fights. They've got duels. They've got ambushes with small amounts of warriors.
Yeah.
And as Ula found out, Egil has a very high body count.
We will get to that. One of the other things I really think is cool, because I am also kind of a legal nerd. I was a paralegal once upon a time in the, away times. This saga provides some really good information on legal cases at the Gula thing. And which is also backed up in other research. One of my favorite books is Bloodletting and Oath-Taking in Medieval Iceland. And it's just a fantastic book, but there are bits of kind of documenting how contests, lawsuits are brought, right? The aggrieved party has to, in front of witnesses, say, "Hey, Bob, you did this thing. Bob, are you here to tell can you confirm, are you hearing me say this?" And then Bob has to say, "Yes, I hear you. Let's go fight." You can't just say, "Hey, Bob's a bad dude," and Bob's not around, can't be around to defend himself, right?
Right. That's just slander. You have to slander people to their faces.
You have to. Right. It's not slander if it's to their face.
Yeah.
So one of the things about Egil, or do you want to go into the Paget's disease bit?
Oh yeah, especially since I was just sort of skimming an article by Jesse Byock, who has sort of a few different things to say about sort of linking the idea of. So first, before I get into this, is Egil a real person? We don't know.
Is anyone a real person? I don't know that I'm a real person.
We, in my personal opinion, I think there was a person, probably named Egil, who lived in Iceland, and was one of the original settlers, or the son of one of the original settlers, and who was probably a very powerful person in the region, and had lots of contact and back and forth with, I think a lot of the points of the story are absolutely plausible, totally real.
Agreed.
But then there's also things in the story that are okay, all right, so he used rune magic to break apart a poisoned cup, right? And you can either decide for yourself whether or not you think that really happened.
Right.
That's not of any concern to me, really, and nor is it actually of much concern who the real figure of Egil could have or would have been.
Right.
But I do think it is interesting, this discussion of, if we take because there's a lot of really weirdly detailed description of his physicality, both from his own words. He talks about his ugliness. He talks about his massive head being so ugly. He talks about everyone talks about his crazy stature. He's so tall.
So huge.
And he's built weird, right? He doesn't have a normal stature. And then as he gets older, he really deteriorates quite quickly. And they make a point. Other people get old in sagas, but Egil, he goes blind, which is one thing, but then his knees and legs,
his hearing, he loses mobility. You could chalk that up to old age and arthritis, but this seems to be
being a warrior for so many years.
Right. Well, sure. I mean, he had a couple hard knocks, but but he's also described both by other people and by himself as a weirdly shaped head and like an overhanging brow, and so I'm picturing like this gorilla.
The number of times they describe his forehead as being like a cliff makes me a little self-conscious because I've got the Goodson 5 head. Right. I'm just like, oh no.
Goodson was way beyond just a 5 head. Like that was, he's got ridges. He's a freaking Kardashian. It's
right. And actually that last bit about like the description of his skull, we got a really interesting, and now let me even put a little more doubt into this story, right? We're talking about the very last paragraph of Egils Saga talks about a priest who, after he first got a pagan burial, and then he was moved to a churchyard, which was fairly typical. People
did it all
moving their relatives like, wait a minute, we're Christian now. We gotta bring them with us.
Very common.
And so he gets moved to a churchyard, and then later a priest decides to exhume him and take a look at the bones, and weirdly decides to he's like, whoa, this guy's skull is so big
and so thick and thick.
And they describe it as being scalloped.
Yep.
Scalloped and ridged and like so thick and big, and they try to smash it with an axe, and it just leaves this little white mark, and doesn't crack the bone at all. And so they're like, oh my God, this has to be Egils because it's gigantic.
Yep.
It probably would have made a very ugly looking person, and also like, oh, whoa.
Well, he was in so many battles, and yet didn't seem to impact him, right? Like he fought so much, which again we'll get into in a second. But other people that have tried to fight that much, they've got their skull is split open and they can't sail for 2 years or whatever, right? They didn't have any problems like that.
And so it's clear that in the saga, this section was put in specifically to sort of reference how incredibly powerful he was. Just like how, and I mentioned this last episode, how at the end of the Lay of Bisclere in Old Norse, which does not happen, Marie de France's Bisclere, the Old French doesn't have this section. This is added in by the Old Norse translator or author or copier in the manuscripts that we have. And it was added in, like Bisclere is a werewolf. He's a French werewolf knight in the courtly romances. And in this, they write in at the end, like, you may think this is unlikely because you don't think werewolves are real, but my cousin saw a werewolf and they're real. And that's why this story is true. Yep. And this is sort of like, to me, this is sort of that kind of an add-on. Like, oh, you think Egil could not have survived? Well, look at how strong and powerful he was, and look at his crazy skull.
It almost sounds like the urban legends sort of thing, right? If you flash your headlights 3 times while driving down Main Street, you'll see the ghost of Mary Pat, whatever.
Right. And so but what is there to say that, like, other than this priest's word, that this was Egil?
Right.
I just want to put in all of that doubt. We A, don't even know if Egil was a real guy, and B, we don't even know if the bones that were dredged up were him. And so, but based with all of these pieces of evidence, if we want to assume that he was real and this was his bones and these descriptions are all accurate, what is likely being described here, what various researchers have sort of teased out, both Icelandic and Jesse Byock. Let me see the, sorry, I'm going to, Thordur Harðarson wrote in Sjúkdómar Egils Skallagrimssonar, Skirnir in 1984, just to reference that particular. It's in Icelandic though, so I have not read that article. But Jesse Byock and Thordur Harðarson are of the opinion that it is likely that it would have been Paget's disease. I think I'm pronouncing that correct.
Yep, Paget's disease.
Paget's disease, which is a rare disease that impacts like your major bones, typically your femur, your pelvis, spine, and skull. And so, for instance, the knees going bad and his legs, they talked about his legs being basically like fused. His knees couldn't bend,
right?
Which is strange, right? He sort of had to walk around. He had a lot of trouble walking, both in his hips and his knees. And then, of course, he's got this hulking figure, and his skull. We talked about all these different sort of. It was very large, and he had like weird brows and asymmetrical. They just call him ugly. Studies have shown that much more modern studies have shown that lots of time attractiveness for humans is symmetry. So they've like actually doctored real people's portraits and just sort of doubled it. And then had one where it's normal and had people rate which one they thought was more attractive, and people would choose the one where the image had been doubled.
Right.
And so this is like,
I always picture him as being very asymmetrical and very lumpy. Lopsided, right? It's kind of what comes through,
right?
Which totally makes sense for Paget's disease,
exactly.
So
because it's a bone disease that affects. It essentially causes so normal bone sloughs and regrows cells on a daily basis. So they lose cells and then they regrow them, but it's uniform throughout the body. But Paget's disease causes the cells to regrow way more aggressively than they're sloughing off. And so that leads to just a buildup of bone cells. And so imagine but patchy, it's not uniform. And so you could easily have like a big buildup of bones. And there's lots of pictures of skulls and things both in the articles and online that you can find that sort of show what this looks like on the bone underneath the skin. And you can pretty easily imagine how that would sort of reformat how someone's face looked. And it's apparently I'll be honest, I am now reading one of those notes. It's a combination of it's caused by a combination of genetics and environment with no real treatment. But there is pain and associated with it, right? Your bones are being fused. We talked about Egil not being able to walk very well. That modern medicine can alleviate a lot of the symptoms, but we don't really have a clear, exactly what. It's a genetic thing, and also epigenetic, a little environmental as well. I am not a medical professional, and I do not have all of the information on this disease. But it seems fairly, especially plausible. When you take it. It seems fairly plausible, especially with I'm in Jesse Byock's article, which is called, once I scroll up to the top of it, Skull and Bones in Egils Saga, a Viking, a Grave, and Paget's Disease. We love the way people name things.
I know, right? Everybody loves a good research paper.
Yeah, there's several images, several figures, not of Egil's skull, but of other patients throughout history who have had their bones studied and pictures taken of their like skulls and things. And there's one particular figure, the corrugated patterns on the skull in an advanced case of Paget's disease that absolutely is exactly what I imagined when they said like a scalloped skull. It was very thick. And so I just think that's super interesting that like we have a pretty kind of like King Richard III and his scoliosis. We've got a pretty good idea of what probably was going on with this guy.
Agreed.
And since it's genetic, think about it. His ugly.
It's ugly. So his
father
what
was
it? His uncle was ugly, and one of his sons. No, was his dad?
His dad was.
Other men in his line are also noted as being, not the most handsomest men on the planet.
But not all of them. It doesn't.
not
It's
all
a
of them.
rare disease, and so it doesn't affect everybody.
Yep.
It's whatever the genetics, whatever's going
Exactly.
on with this. It didn't affect the Thorolfs, for instance. It didn't. So really interesting to see. And so I think probably Kveldulf and Skallagrim may have had something similar.
Yep.
Where
totally
they
makes
also
sense.
real people.
So Bradley, Andre the Giant, Bradley put something in the chat. So Andre the Giant actually, I can see where you could make that connection. Andre's malady was actually an overproduction of growth hormone.
Yes.
And it was more of a pituitary disease than a skeletal disease. But yes, there are some similarities between, anything that can make a person larger than normal size.
Right. And so the kind of gigantism, as it's called with Andre the Giant, that growth hormone essentially makes it's the growth hormone that tells your long bones to keep growing. And your long bones are like in your arms and your legs and your spine. So those just kept going, and that's why he became very large. But yeah, it's unlikely. I don't think Egil had that too. I think it was most.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think he was just a big guy.
Big guy. All right, so let's get on to some kills because I love a good kill because I'm a weirdo. So Egil, precocious little child that he killed his first person at the age of 7 over a ball game. Another kid running around, playing in a field, playing a ball game. Egil didn't like the way this game was going, so he went and got an axe and came back and split the kid's skull because that's a normal thing to do.
A 14-year-old gave him the axe.
Well, sure.
And then they both went over and killed the guy. But Egil's
So Egil killed his first person at 7. He once killed 11 men single-handedly after leaping. So they had run across this bridge over a waterway, a causeway, and then had a farm drainage field, and then they had pulled the bridge onto their side, saying "Nana, boo boo, you can't get us." And Egil and his men were on the other side. Egil jumps this water diversion and water drainage thing in a field, kills those 11 men, and then puts the bridge back so his guys can come back over it.
Yeah,
awesome. He participated in multiple legal duels. One includes killing his opponent by biting his throat because his sword blows were not doing any good. So clearly his opponent was using magic to, keep his sword from landing properly. So, sword's not doing it. I'm just going to jump you and rip your throat out with my teeth. And then
it's a very Beowulf and Grendel. You can't be touched by weaponry, so I'll just rip your arm off kind of deal.
Exactly. And rip your own arm off and beat you with it. And then once he's done biting this man's throat out, he goes over to the sacrificial bull that is there. Now, it is noted as being an old bull. It's not young, but he grabs this bull by the head, the horns, flips it up over his back, over the bull's back, breaks its back. Like, dude, big guy.
Yeah, this bull was set out to be slaughtered sacrificially by the victor of the duel, and in his rage, like in one motion, he bites this guy. He pounces on this guy, takes him to the ground, rips his throat out with his teeth, then stands up. I mean, probably just drenched in blood coming out of his mouth, grabs onto a bull's horns and just kills it in one big wrestling flop. And it's just like, if I had seen that, I'd be like, I'm going home.
Yeah,
I'm out of here. I don't know what just happened, but I didn't like any of it.
Yeah. He once set an entire farmhouse on fire, killing everybody that was inside. There's no note of how many people were inside. We know of a couple of people, but we also know it was a full farmhouse. So 30 people.
That's what I would say.
That is not counted in this, but all in all, he is noted as killing at least 50 people. Like 50 people is his. You can say, oh, yep, that one that
personally. And does that even include, that doesn't include him in the Battle of Brunanburg either.
Oh no,
because we have no idea, but it's assumed he was fighting, and there's moments where he hacks people side to side. There's no way to count that.
50 is just the kind of like named kills, right? None of them were considered murder.
No.
So like in Texas, you know, the guy just needed killing. So he was never, he didn't commit a crime and was never subjugated to outlawry.
He wasn't outlawed for killing people, but he was, or kind of, he was outlawed several times by whoever at the time was king of Norway.
It wasn't the killing, it was because he was a dick.
Right, yeah, it was always related to the feud, and oftentimes, like, it was, like, right after he killed some people, but, like, he technically had, like, feud justification for doing those killings, and so he wasn't, like, a murderer. He was just,
there were extenuating circumstances sort of thing. Virginia, so 50 I would say, yes, 50 named people. They didn't all, you know, the saga doesn't say it was, you know, Thorfinn's, but it was, you know, the farmer's son, right?
Right. Or like in the ambush, it's like, okay, there were 8 men with Ulf, right? There's 2 brothers Ulfs, and they like, okay, 8 men with this Ulf, right? So like specifically numbered, and then also attached to a name, usually.
So Virginia, that's a great way to put it. 50 named people and some number of red shirt extras. Yes.
Yeah.
I'd say that like the farmhouse, we know there were 3 named people in that farmhouse fire, but we know that there were more than that. So the 50 named people has those 3. And then we know that there were more. So that's the at least 50. Those red shirts were like, could have been 10, could have been 30. We don't know. All in all, a total of 407 deaths are recorded in this one saga.
Not including all those extras also.
Yeah. This is just the ones that we can actually kind of pinpoint, right? Like, it is the most deadly saga. It has got the most deaths and the most, you know, I don't know. I just love it because everybody dies.
I was saying right before we started this stream, this saga even gives like the Iliad a run for its money, and that's literally about the Trojan War. So,
so we also have runes and magic.
Yes.
So, do you want to go into that?
So we have as I'll sort of touch on a little bit more later, Egil's a very Odinic figure. And every once in a while, usually we think about it as like poetry, warrior. He's a poetic warrior. But also he has a few times where he uses rune magic, which is interesting because I don't think it's ever explained how he knows rune magic.
It isn't, yeah.
We know his whole life, but we don't know how or where or why he ever learned runes.
He just has this ability.
And then in Sonatorek, the poem of the loss of his sons, towards the end, when he's talking about how Odin has forsaken him, we'll talk about that later, he references the several times in which he did Odinic things, like using runes. He's like, I know the runes and I've done this stuff. For instance, discovering a rune stick that a boy had carved because he was sweet on a girl and wanted to make her fall in love with him, but he carved the runes wrong and made her very sick. Egil found the rune stick, disposed of it properly, rewrote the runes, and she immediately got better, right? So he does that. There's an instance where he, Eric's wife, Gunhild, King Eric, so Queen Gunhild really doesn't like Egil. And so she tries to poison him at a feast. And when Egil receives the cup from her, he carves some runes onto the cup and then cuts his hand open and smears his blood onto the runes. and the cup bursts in his hand, and he knows it's been poisoned when that happens. So the rune magic essentially saves him from having to drink this thing. And she was like, "Oh no, don't drink it." He also carves runes on a rune pole or a scorn pole. Gosh, I'm trying to think of the Old Norse word. Neath pole.
It's a neathing pole, but
there's another specific word. Oh, it might come to me, it might not. Like it's got an S, like a string something. Anyway, it doesn't matter. This is the something that if you were paying attention to the news, it happens every once in a while in Iceland, and more so recently. I think in 2011 is the first time I was really aware of someone using a neathing pole as protest against Parliament in Iceland, which I think is just so great. Where they put a horse head, and they were using, I think, paper mache, but it is assumed that Egil used a real horse head on top of a pole, and then you carve some sort of runes and then speak those words. And we can get into runes some other day about how they are sort of they are supposed to be sort of, rather than we think of words that are written as written words,
right?
But they think of them as permanent spoken words.
Right.
And the speaking of magical words is very important. And so that's why runes have power, not necessarily really their shape, but the fact that they are the physical
embodiment of a
spoken incantation.
Spoken thing. Yeah.
And so he says this curse. He's trying to just make a big old show of cursing the king of Norway, and turns the horse's head to look towards them. And so he does this big thing, and
they're not there, by the way. They are in fact in Norway, and he does this in Iceland.
Yeah. So he just sort of
there's a lot of ocean between where he's at and where he wants this curse to be directed.
It's a long distance curse. He can't be there in person to make them hear it, so he has to do it back here. And so, and then there's other places where magic comes up not being used by Egil. For instance, we already talked about that guy who Egil killed with his teeth, who was using magic to make himself impervious to weapons.
Right.
We've got shapeshifters. Gunhild supposedly shapeshifts into a bird. Or it could be Gunhild, it could be something else. Shapeshifts into a bird.
To keep him up at night, or to distract him when he's supposed to be writing this poem that's going to save his own life. Queen Gunhild also cursed him to be restless and depressed. So we've got magic. So we have multiple people writing runes for magical purposes. We have multiple instances of some sort of magic, which both pro and con Egil, right?
Right. We've got
they both help him and hinder him.
Exactly. And it's just sort of woven in and not really made a big deal of. There are some things, if you go back to our October episodes, there are some sagas that go heavy on the magic and the creepy, spooky monsters and Draugr and all these different creatures of the night and hauntings and stuff. This saga really doesn't. I mean, even Laxdæla Saga, which has a lot of the same characters as in those genealogy sections. Laxdæla Saga has way more ghosts and prophecies but this saga, it's just sort of matter of fact.
It's kind of part of everyday life that there's magic and there's rune magic and
it's just sort of but it seems like it's very hard to. It isn't so ingrained in life that like everybody knows about magic, everybody has magic,
Right.
and it's like very few very powerful specific people can use magic, and when they do, honestly, let's be real, it's not that like hot, like it's not that much magic,
Right.
like it's like, I can tell that this has been poisoned.
Right.
I'm cursing you from afar,
Yes.
which has no tangible
Yep.
like
Right.
visible confirmation that that's worked. We've got someone, I think the most dramatic thing that happens is the rune stick that made the girl sick,
Mhm.
and then her getting immediately better.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's one of the most dramatic, other than like and so
Yeah.
it's
And
interesting.
I think I'm actually going to go back to that. So the rune stick that made the girl sick. It's interesting that so when Egil comes to this farmhouse, the farmer's daughter is sick. He's like, well, here's your problem. These runes were carved improperly. Gets him, fixes that up, goes on his merry way. And when he comes back through is when he finds what the rune stick was supposed to be. Like it was so screwed up that he couldn't even figure out what the person was trying to accomplish, right? Yeah, like that's and it was just, and it's told in a very matter-of-fact way. So so the poems, there are like I said, 60-ish poems in multiple poetic forms, like equally well. There's a drapa, there's all kinds, there's everything. All of the kind of typical Norse poetic styles are
skaldic.
Not right.
Just to clarify, skaldic poetic styles rather than the Eddic ones, which are so named because they are those poetic styles that show up in the Poetic Edda.
Right.
That's it. Right. That's just the distinction.
That is
skaldic poems are made by skalds, which are poets.
Yes, exactly. It is the first instance of using end rhyme in an Old Norse poem. The Rune Hendra meter. That's in his head ransom poem. It's the first instance of end rhyming in a Norse poem. It was seen in. It wasn't seen in Germanic poetry either. So where this came from, there's different theories as to why he did this end rhyming shift. And it could be that I've read an article that was, it could have been that it was kind of coming from the Latin, which that implies that he understands Latin, which maybe a bit far-fetched.
Or at least heard some of it. The interesting thing is, so when you say that, because I actually hadn't heard that before, about being the first time. Is it the first time because of the manuscript age, or is it the first time because of the age of when the story is supposed to take place?
That is a great question, and I don't know.
Because I have a feeling it's if this poem was written by Egil at the time that it was supposed to be taking place,
I think you're right.
Then it would be the earliest format of this. Right. But folks.
Yeah, this was written 300 years after the fact, right? So, right, yes.
I would like to say, and I will continue, just like how we say Snorri Sturluson wrote Heimskringla and Egils Saga and the Eddas and all these other things. I will continue to say that this is Egil's poem and that he wrote it, because I have no one else to say.
Right.
But also, it could be, and I am now looking at the Hufvudstrápa in Old Norse, and absolutely, it actually has. I've never looked at I'm realizing right now that I've never actually taken a close look at this in Old Norse, and the end rhymes are, I thought it was maybe going to be a little bit like the Lilia poem, which is a much later poem. We know exactly who wrote it. We know exactly why, and is one of the first Hrunhent poems, which was the format that sort of took over in popularity right after Drottfights, which usually the most skaldic poetry is in a Drottfight format.
Right, which is a very formal
so this
format.
Hrunhent has end rhymes in it, which is kind of fun and interesting. But this is like egregious. I mean, listen to the first verse, and they're all like this. Vester fork of ver, en ek vidrus bear, Moonstrander mar, svos mit of far. Druk eik of flot, vid isa brot. Hlödk merdar hlut, mins knarar skut. It's literally rhyming couplets the entire poem.
It is. It's full on Dr. Seuss, green eggs and ham, and it's in Old Norse, Old Icelandic.
I can't believe I've never looked.
I can't believe you never saw that before. Wow. All right.
Again, it's kind of a boring subject matter, right? This is the Hufvudstrapa, which is just like he's a king, he's generous, he kills people.
It's the most boring, life-saving poem ever. So Egil composed his first poem at the age of 3. So at least his first poem came before his first kill by a couple of years, sort of. Bearsty froze again. I'm on my own. And his poetry was good enough to be used as payment for the reciprocation of gift giving, and also to save his own life with that kind of mailed it in poem. Right. But as reciprocation for gift giving, as we've talked about several times, gift giving in Norse culture, sometimes it's a true exchange. Sometimes it's kind of a one-upsmanship. But gift giving, like you have to, if you're given something, you have to give something back.
Yeah,
and they don't necessarily have to be of the same value. Bearsy could give me, a bearskin rug, and I can give him a brooch, right? Whatever. The gift has been reciprocated, even though it's not of equal value. But his poetry is good enough. He can just, Egil can get that bearskin and then drop, 12 lines of poetry and be like, done. Right?
That's it.
That is pretty damn impressive.
And people are happy to have it, especially because oftentimes those poems, and so, okay, 2 things. One, the gift giving is like how to solidify alliances. Mm-hmm. Even if you hate somebody's guts, giving them a gift and doing that exchange is how to solidify an alliance, which is also kind of part of what's going on with the Hufvudstrapa, right? Like he gives Harold.
No,
it's Eric. No, Eric. Right.
Eric.
There's so many kings. He gives Eric this poem, and Eric in return gives him his head. Right. And also that sort of solidifies, like, at the very least, we don't have a feud anymore. We've resolved our feud. I was just about to say,
it didn't actually end the feud.
Yeah, but it didn't ever come up again. It's sort of because the thing is, he said, like, get out of here and never let me see you again.
Right.
And Egil did.
And Egil did. I do believe, though, that if Egil had come back to Norway, Eric would have been like, it's on.
But Eric died before that could happen. And for all intents and purposes, it ended. The second thing I was going to say was more related to what you had just said.
All right, well, I'll keep rolling. So
yeah, you keep going.
So one of the great things about it is I think it provides some really deep psychological insight into into Egil, who's this famous person, but I think also into Snorri as well, if he really truly was the author. Mm-hmm. So the overall saga, the story itself, portrays Egil as he's cruel and overbearing. But then the embedded poetry shows him as very vulnerable and emotional. He praises true friendships, grieves the loss of his sons, and ponders the inevitability of aging and death, which is the poetry part of it is so insightful and so personal.
Yeah.
And soft and squishy, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
Because Egil himself was like this mean mofo. Right. So it's kind of the duality of an outward appearance, an outward projection, and then true, like, mental internal gymnastics. Right.
Which is quite unusual. This display of, like, very deep and especially grief is very unusual for, like, Viking men. This ideal, this hyper masculine ideal of, like, the only emotions that ideal are allowed to feel is, like, rage towards your enemies, right? Like,
Right.
and righteous anger at like being slighted, because your reputation, and this is what I remembered what I was going to say. Your reputation is everything.
Yes.
As the Havamal very famously, this is one of the few verses that people like quote all the time. Crops die, cattle die, so too will you die. But I know one thing that never dies, and that is a man's reputation.
Yep.
Your especially if you're looking at like Iceland, where there's no formal monarchy, like you're not going to get your name written down in these books unless you do something cool.
Right.
And the books are very important. I'll get to that in a second. But if you're receiving a gift from Egil, this is the point I was going to make. If you're receiving a gift from Egil, like Arnbjorn has multiple poems written about him, that's incredible, because Arnbjorn's never going to be forgotten.
Right.
Your reputation has been solidified in a poetic form, which is one of the few things that will last, at least.
Right. It's not, it's beyond. So we think of word fame is the, it's praise. It's making, people know who you are, even if they've never met you, sort of thing.
Right.
So Egil writing these verses for other people is cementing those bonds by giving them this word fame.
Right.
Because it's now memorialized, right? And that's a really key thing. And
we've talked about the converse of this, for instance, when we talk about like sarcastic Holly and other people who are writing defamatory poems, and we talk about Neath, and right, like the opposite of this is where like you really don't want to get on the bad side of a skald who's gonna write a poem that says that you smell bad and you're bad in bed.
Right.
And there's poems out there. All we know about the guy is that some poet says that he smelled bad and was bad in bed.
Yes. And that is still word fame. It's just not the kind you want.
That's your eternal recognition. And so having a very a well-crafted poem written by a very important famous guy about you in praise of you is actually like it's
like gold.
Priceless.
It really is. And it's so one of the things we say in the SCA is don't piss off a bard, right? Because they'll make a song about you. That's exactly what this is. There's a good skald, a good bard can either make or break you, right? Exactly. And you want them to make you. So
Never underestimate the bards in your party.
Absolutely true. So I that's the end of what I had, and you've got a couple more things, and we might actually finish on time today.
Oh my goodness. I had just sort of like I was sort of spitballing in my head, and I was realizing some things, and this is where we're going to get more into conjecture. But I was thinking about the fact that Egil is often held up to be the ideal Viking man, right? There's only a few things where he doesn't quite live up to like the bit. I wouldn't even really necessarily include his like emotions of grief at the time of his son's death and all that stuff. Because he turns it around into an amazing poem. And so it just like immediately, whatever, about him getting a little blather at the end. And he laments the fact that he's less able-bodied and no longer a warrior, no longer a big fighter, and he feels that he's been abandoned by Odin.
Yes.
He's often, I mean, it's obvious. He's an Odinic figure. He does poetry, he does some rune magic, and he's an amazing warrior.
Yes.
He talks about being connected to Odin. He talks about being forsaken by Odin by the end. And the thing is that archaeological and like name and textual evidence, like place name and other evidence to sort of track worship. We know very little about worshiping in the pagan days of early medieval Scandinavia. But what we do know, what we can kind of piece together is that Odin, although he has a lot of stories about him, and we know a lot about him, and he's a very interesting figure, didn't seem to be worshipped all that much.
Right.
And of course, every fjord, every field, every valley is going to have a different, like, either major god or set of gods that they really
absolutely.
And there's different cults. We call them cults don't be like, oh, cults. Just, you know, small religious groups, essentially.
Yeah.
These aren't people of a book. There's no Bible. There's no set out, like, you know, they weren't reading the Poetic Edda. It wasn't written. There's stories, and each person is going to tell a slightly different version of the story. And so people are worshiping different gods, but the most commonly worshipped gods in medieval Scandinavia, and depends on where you are, who's more common, but are Thor and Freyr, which makes perfect sense because Thor is a protector, a man of the people. He has a hammer, and Freyr is a fertility and agriculture god. So if you're a farmer, he's a really obvious choice.
Yes.
And so there's only a few places that really reference Odin. It seems very much so that the cult of Odin became more popular with wealthy, powerful people, and he became a more popular figure as sort of Harald Fairhair and other people, Harold Bluetooth in Denmark, are sort of consolidating power and wealth into their own coffers and sort of setting up a much more stratified society where there's an aristocracy, and then there's farmers, rather than like in Iceland where it's like the aristocrats are just the wealthiest farmers, and then everybody else.
And they're wealthy because they got there first. They got the best land. Like, it's not because they're necessarily great and amazing farmers. They just got there first. So
and when we look at Iceland, especially in this time period with no monarchy, wealth, how are you going to display your wealth? There's no damn resources on that island. They cut down all the trees. They had to go all the way to Finland in North America just to get trees. Because there's not much there. There's ivory that they can trade, but the one of the things that was the biggest sort of display of wealth and power is having books, because, for instance, Flateyra book, which is a quite large manuscript, about this tall and then that thick, probably took over 400 sheep to create, just the vellum. And then you have to have somebody write on every single one of those pages. And that takes time and effort and energy and money to create. And so owning a book, one book, is an incredible display of wealth and power.
Yes.
So I'm leading up here to a proposition, and that is that Egil is an idealized Viking masculine figure, for wealthy and powerful people, but not necessarily for the common person. So he's in a book, right? He's he as a leader, as a ruler, he's pretty bad to his farm.
He's not a good farm manager. He's not. He goes off raiding all the time and leaves the farming to other people. Like, he's not. His fame is in his external stuff, right?
He brings back lots of wealth, but he actually fails to do the vital step of doing that. The point of Vikings, the point of going Viking, is to go get wealth somewhere else, bring it back home, and share it with everybody. But he and his father are greedy. And
not so much with the sharing of that wealth. They just go and get it. And that we talked on that when we were going over this in the previous episodes. Both he and his father buried multiple chests of silver out in the world somewhere, and nobody knows where they're at.
So that no one else could have them.
So which is so
before they died.
Right. When and then they both died. One of the things in a small agricultural community is that you all have to be in it together. You can't, if there's 15 people on your farm, you all have to pool resources. You have to, you can't be that greedy person that goes out and buries wealth just out of spite so no one else can have it.
Right.
Like, that is so against the cultural norm.
Right.
of
And
the
like,
time.
think about the fact that what are the things I said are the typical imagery for a good ruler. You kill a lot of people, so you feed the ravens, you feed the carrion animals, usually because you're like a warrior. You're just strong. So you kill a lot of people, and you're generous. You're a breaker.
Uh-oh. Who froze?
Of rain.
See?
Am I back?
You're back.
Okay. I don't know where I cut out, but if you're a generous ruler, that's the thing you should be. A breaker, a destroyer of rings, someone who's giving out wealth to your household, to your retinue, your hird. And so Egil like really breaks from tradition by being not that at all. And so it's interesting because I wanted to sort of challenge like that he's always held up as like the perfect Viking. I'm like, but he isn't. He falls short on a lot of different things.
Right, on the social norms, you know, yeah. If I were to give him a great, you know, report card, warrior killer, high marks, good guy, and adhering to social norms, not so much.
Not so much. And you can be an asshole. Right. And still be a hero, but you have to be generous.
Right.
Being an asshole and being generous are two very different things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Evan has a great question. I'm actually going to put on the screen if it works. There we go. Do you have a sense whether Odin was less commonly worshipped partially because ordinary people did not want to get his attention, like we see with the Greek Erinnes and the fair folk? Or did it seem to mostly be a matter of relevance of a subsistence farming society? And you're right. I wouldn't want to get Egil's attention either if I were a farmer. And I actually don't know. I'm not that good with the Norse gods. So,
I can totally see what you're saying. Odin would not be someone you would want to get the attention of either, according to what we know of him, right? But it really does seem more so of like, you can't, as just a regular farmer, you don't really have very much in common with him. Yeah. He doesn't live in the kind of favors you might be able to ask of him don't really line up.
Odin
if that's what you're going to be doing, which also we don't know if that's the kind of worship that's going on of like asking.
And as a subsistence farmer, I would put my eggs in the basket with the fertility gods, not with the war gods. I don't want war. I don't want killing people on my land because that's bad juju. So yeah, I
don't want to be a warrior. I'm not a poet. I'm not even a king. I'm just some farmer guy. And like Thor offers protection, like very specifically. He's a giant killer, right? He's going to protect you. So so many Mjolnir, so many Thor's hammers in all these grave sites. Right. Also lots of places that are named after Freyr. People and like we've even got, if you want to read Hrafnkel's Saga, which is a great saga, Hrafnkel name is sort of a gothi of Freyr. His primary god is clearly Freyr, and he's a poor farmer in Iceland. This makes sense. It lines up. Whereas Odin's
not actually a very useful god.
No.
He's not going to help you with your stuff.
And also the other, just as an add-on, it seems that in a lot of places, people would have one or maybe two or three sort of main gods that they've worshipped, much like imagine the Roman Empire, especially when we've got such disparate places with their own religions sort of butting up against and meshing in, and the Romans sort of subsuming religions into the polytheistic Roman pantheon. Where people would sort of have patron gods, but then they also had sort of household gods, and that's the Disir in Old Norse. So the Disir, these sort of spirits of the land that often were also worshipped, or at least revered in some way, given due reverence, because those are localized land
very
spirits.
Localized. And they're localized to that fjord, to that farm. Right. Yeah.
And so most of the worship that we know about, and this is not my area of expertise, and I'm going to put that out there right now, but most of that worship from what I've learned, seems to have been like kind of small scale, and about like your local gods, your local like spirits, and making sure the actual physical land is healthy so that you can farm on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Great
All right.
question. I love that.
That was a great question. I think we might finally be done with Egils Saga. I mean,
I think
we're not going to revisit it at some point. Also, because there's so much cross connection in the genealogy with Loxdale Saga. Harold's Saga is referenced in Egils, basically saying, "Hey, there's this guy named Harold. I could tell you about him, but you should go read his saga instead." Right?
Literally, yeah.
Which is pretty much what it boils down to. So I think we're going to wrap up Egil next week. Wait, next week? No, sorry. We are taking next week off because we need to cleanse our brain after 6 episodes of Egil.
It was a marathon, truly.
It was a marathon, exactly. And next time we are going to focus on one of the short stories. We haven't picked one yet. So as soon as we pick one, we'll let you know. And because it's a short story, you'll be able to, I know, right?
Rifling through.
You can, it's more accessible. You can read the story before our show and, have some idea of what we're talking about. But that's what we've got for today. Do you have any final words, Bercy?
I love Egils Saga, and this was very fun. And I'm glad. I hope you all enjoyed this too.
Excellent. Yeah, right? I hope so. All right. Well, we will see everybody on June 5th with a short story that will be determined in the next week. How's that?
June already.
I know. It's crazy town. All right. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye.